Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're diving into a story that might sound lighthearted on the surface, but trust me, the implications run deep into the worlds of corporate power, scientific research, and the surveillance of an entire generation's imagination.
I'm Maya Clarity, and Alex, when we first saw this story come across the wire, I'll admit, I raised an eyebrow. Pokémon turns 30 years old. But then we started pulling the threads, and what we found is a fascinating case study in how a single corporate franchise has embedded itself into the infrastructure of modern science, data collection, and even how we understand the natural world itself.
That's exactly right, Maya. We're talking about a media empire valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars, one that has quietly shaped how researchers think, how children interact with technology, and how corporations harvest behavioral data from the youngest users on the planet. Tonight, we follow the money, we follow the data, and we follow the Pokémon.
And for our viewers who might be tempted to tune out because this sounds like a fluff piece, let me be clear. When Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on Earth, publishes a deep analysis of how a fictional franchise has shaped actual scientific research, that is a signal worth paying attention to. The line between entertainment and institutional influence has never been blurrier.
So stay with us, because by the end of this broadcast, you'll never look at a Pikachu the same way again. Let's get into it.
Alex, let's start with the headline. According to Nature, published February 27, 2026, the Pokémon franchise is officially turning 30 this year. And Nature isn't just marking the anniversary with a nostalgic retrospective. They published a serious investigation into how this Japanese media sensation has, and I'm quoting directly here, inspired generations of researchers in fields as diverse as evolution, biodiversity, and research integrity.
Let that sink in for a moment. Research integrity. We're not just talking about biologists who grew up catching Bulbasaurs and then decided to study real amphibians. Nature is documenting a phenomenon where a corporate entertainment product has fundamentally altered the trajectory of scientific inquiry. And we need to ask the hard question, is that influence benign, or is something more complicated going on?
Let's lay out the facts first. Pokémon launched in 1996 in Japan as a pair of video games for the Nintendo Game Boy. The concept was simple but brilliant: collect fictional creatures, each with unique traits, types, and evolutionary pathways. Within years, it exploded into the single highest-grossing media franchise in human history. We're talking over $100 billion in total revenue across games, trading cards, television, films, and merchandise.
$100 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the Star Wars franchise, more than Marvel, more than Harry Potter. And what's remarkable is that unlike those franchises, which are built primarily on narrative storytelling, Pokémon is built on something far more powerful. It's built on taxonomy. On classification. On the fundamental human drive to observe, categorize, and collect living things. That is a scientific impulse, hardwired into us, and the Pokémon company monetized it.
And according to the Nature analysis, this wasn't just a one-way street. The franchise didn't just borrow from science. It fed back into it. Researchers across the world have documented what they call the Pokémon effect, where children who grew up immersed in the franchise developed measurably different cognitive relationships with biodiversity. A landmark study published several years ago found that British children could identify more Pokémon species than actual native wildlife species. Think about that.
That study has been cited hundreds of times in the scientific literature, and it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the intersection of corporate media and environmental awareness. On one hand, you have conservation organizations spending millions trying to get children to care about endangered species. On the other hand, you have a corporation that, without even trying to serve an educational mission, made an entire generation fluent in a fictional taxonomy of over 900 creatures, complete with habitats, behaviors, and evolutionary lineages.
And here's where it gets really interesting from a surveillance and data perspective, Alex, because this is Truth Report and that's our beat. The Pokémon franchise didn't just live on Game Boys and television screens. In 2016, Niantic Labs launched Pokémon Go, an augmented reality mobile game that became the fastest app ever to reach 500 million downloads. And what was Pokémon Go really doing? It was mapping the world. It was tracking the movement patterns of hundreds of millions of people in real time.
This is the part of the story that most outlets won't touch. Niantic Labs, the company behind Pokémon Go, was originally an internal startup within Google. Let me say that again. The company that built the world's most popular augmented reality game, a game played primarily by children and young adults, was born inside the world's largest data collection company. Niantic's founder, John Hink, previously led Google's Geo division, which created Google Maps and Google Earth. The surveillance infrastructure was baked in from the beginning.
And the data that Pokémon Go collected was staggering. Location data, movement patterns, how long people lingered in certain areas, which routes they walked, what times of day they were active. The game used so-called Pokestops and gyms placed at real-world landmarks, effectively creating a crowdsourced mapping operation that would make any intelligence agency envious. Players were voluntarily conducting surveillance on their own neighborhoods and feeding that data back to a company with deep ties to Google's infrastructure.
Now, to be fair, Niantic has maintained that it takes user privacy seriously and that location data is used to improve the game experience. But we've seen this playbook before, haven't we, Maya? We collect your data to improve your experience. That's the same language used by every major tech platform that has subsequently been caught monetizing, sharing, or inadequately protecting user data. And when your primary user base skews young, the ethical stakes are even higher.
Absolutely. And what's particularly striking is the contrast between the wholesome image of the Pokémon brand, these cute collectible creatures, and the sophisticated data machinery operating underneath. This is a pattern we see again and again in the tech surveillance landscape. The friendlier the interface, the more aggressively the data extraction operates behind the scenes. Pokémon Go was a masterclass in making surveillance feel like play.
But let's get back to the science angle, because the Nature article raises another set of questions that deserve scrutiny. According to their reporting, Pokémon hasn't just influenced how people think about biodiversity. It's directly shaped academic research. Scientists have named real newly discovered species after Pokémon characters. There's a genus of electric ants named after Pikachu. A species of bee fly was named after a Pokémon. On the surface, this seems harmless, even charming. But what does it mean when corporate intellectual property starts colonizing the formal taxonomic record of life on Earth?
That's a profound question, and it gets at something the Nature piece addresses, which is the concept of research integrity. When scientists name species after Pokémon, they're doing more than paying homage to a childhood favorite. They're embedding a corporate brand into the permanent scientific record. Those names can never be changed under the rules of taxonomic nomenclature. 100 years from now, when the Pokémon company may or may not still exist, the biological literature will still carry its fingerprints. That is a form of corporate influence over public knowledge that we rarely discuss.
And it goes deeper than naming conventions. The Nature article documents how Pokémon's fictional evolutionary mechanics have been used as teaching tools in university biology courses. Professors use Pokémon evolution, where creatures transform into more powerful forms, as an entry point to discuss real Darwinian evolution. Now, there's an obvious pedagogical appeal here. Students are engaged, they already know the material, and it lowers the barrier to complex concepts. But there's a real risk in using a fundamentally inaccurate model of evolution as a gateway to the real thing.
Right, because Pokémon evolution is nothing like actual biological evolution. In the games, evolution is an individual transformation. A single Charmander transforms into a Charmeleon. In real biology, evolution operates on populations over generations through natural selection, genetic drift, and mutation. These are fundamentally different processes, and conflating them, even as a teaching metaphor, can create persistent misconceptions. Several studies in science education have documented exactly this confusion among students exposed to the Pokémon model.
So we have a situation where a corporate entertainment product is simultaneously inspiring scientific interest, distorting scientific understanding, embedding itself in the taxonomic record, and operating one of the largest location surveillance platforms ever deployed. And all of this under the banner of cute cartoon creatures. This is what makes the Pokémon phenomenon so important as a case study for our viewers.
And let's talk about the economic power structures here, because that's always where Truth Report goes. The Pokémon Company is jointly owned by three entities: Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Incorporated. This triumvirate controls one of the most valuable intellectual properties in human history, and they exercise that control with extraordinary discipline. The licensing agreements, the merchandising deals, the media partnerships, all of it is managed with a level of corporate coordination that rivals any Fortune 500 operation.
And yet, because the product is perceived as children's entertainment, it escapes the regulatory scrutiny that we apply to other industries with comparable reach and influence. When Facebook collects data on young users, there's congressional hearings. When TikTok's algorithm targets teenagers, there's national security investigations. But when a Pokémon app tracks the real-time location of hundreds of millions of users including children, the conversation is about how much fun it is to catch a Snorlax in the park.
That double standard is worth examining closely. The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, in the United States theoretically protects users under 13 from data collection. But the enforcement of COPPA in the context of gaming apps has been notoriously weak. And Pokémon Go's terms of service set the age requirement at 13, effectively pushing compliance responsibility onto parents and children themselves, not onto the platform. We've seen how well that works with every other app that has tried the same approach, which is to say, not well at all.
Now, I want to be clear about something, because good journalism requires nuance. The Nature article is documenting a genuinely interesting and, in many ways, positive phenomenon. The fact that Pokémon inspired a generation of kids to think about creatures, habitats, evolution, and biodiversity is not inherently sinister. Many of those kids became the scientists who are now making real discoveries about the natural world. That inspiration is real, and it matters.
Absolutely. And the researchers featured in the Nature piece are passionate, brilliant people who are doing important work. The question isn't whether Pokémon's influence on science is real. It clearly is. The question is whether we're being honest about the full scope of that influence, including the parts that are commercially motivated, the parts that distort understanding, and the parts that involve unprecedented data collection. You can appreciate the inspiration while still interrogating the infrastructure.
And that brings us to one of the most overlooked dimensions of this story, which is the neurological one. In 2019, a study published in the journal Nature Human Behavior, same prestigious journal, found that adults who played Pokémon extensively as children had developed a dedicated brain region for recognizing Pokémon characters. A literal neural pathway shaped by a corporate product. The researchers used functional MRI scans to identify this region, located in the occipitotemporal sulcus, the same part of the brain that processes faces and other visually important categories.
That study sent shockwaves through the neuroscience community because it demonstrated something remarkable and, frankly, unsettling about corporate media's ability to physically reshape the developing brain. These weren't temporary memories or passing interests. The MRI scans showed permanent structural adaptations. The Pokémon company had, without any deliberate intent, conducted one of the largest uncontrolled neurological experiments in human history, training millions of developing brains to devote cognitive resources to recognizing fictional creatures.
And no ethics board approved that experiment. No informed consent was obtained. No longitudinal study was designed to track outcomes. It simply happened, as a byproduct of commercial entertainment, and we only discovered it decades later when those children grew up and laid down in MRI machines. This is the frontier of corporate influence that we should all be paying attention to, the capacity of media products to alter the physical structure of the brain at scale.
Let's pivot to the broader pattern here, Alex, because this connects to everything we cover on Truth Report. The Pokémon story is ultimately about how corporate power operates in the 21st century. It doesn't look like the robber barons of the Gilded Age. It doesn't announce itself with smokestacks and Pinkerton guards. It comes wrapped in bright colors and catchy theme songs. It embeds itself in childhood memories, academic research, and the neural architecture of an entire generation.
And the surveillance component is the thread that ties it all together. Because what is Pokémon fundamentally about? Collection. Observation. Cataloging. Gotta catch 'em all isn't just a slogan. It's a behavioral framework. It trains users from childhood to accept that the proper relationship with the world is one of comprehensive capture and documentation. Every creature must be found, observed, recorded, and stored in your Pokédex, your personal database.
That's a fascinating and deeply uncomfortable parallel, Alex. The Pokédex is essentially a surveillance tool within the game's fiction. You point it at a creature, and it automatically records everything about that creature, its measurements, its habits, its location. Now translate that into the real world, where we point our phones at everything around us, and apps automatically record our measurements, our habits, and our location. The Pokédex was training wheels for the surveillance economy.
I want to be careful here because I'm not suggesting some grand conspiracy where Nintendo executives sat in a room in 1995 and said, let's condition children to accept surveillance. That's not how these things work. What actually happens is more subtle and, in some ways, more concerning. Cultural products create normative frameworks. They shape what feels natural, what feels fun, what feels like the obvious way to interact with the world. And a generation raised on gotta catch 'em all is a generation primed to accept gotta track 'em all.
And when Nature magazine, the flagship journal of global science, publishes a piece celebrating Pokémon's influence on research, it represents something significant about institutional acceptance of corporate influence on knowledge production. 30 years ago, the idea that a video game franchise could shape the direction of serious academic research would have seemed absurd. Today, it's presented as an inspiring story. That normalization itself is worth examining.
The Nature piece also touches on something that we at Truth Report find particularly relevant, which is how Pokémon has influenced conservation discourse. Several conservation organizations have partnered with the Pokémon company on awareness campaigns. The logic is simple, Pokémon gets people excited about creatures, so harness that excitement for real conservation. But these partnerships also serve to greenwash a franchise that is, at its core, a consumer product manufactured in facilities, shipped globally, and designed to drive continuous purchasing behavior.
The environmental footprint of the Pokémon franchise itself is enormous. The trading card game alone consumes massive quantities of paper, ink, and plastic packaging. The electronic games require hardware manufactured through global supply chains with well-documented labor and environmental issues. The merchandise, the plush toys, the figurines, the clothing lines, all of it feeds into consumption patterns that are fundamentally at odds with conservation values. But the conservation partnerships provide a veneer of environmental responsibility that deflects from these realities.
And here's a number that should stop everyone in their tracks. The Pokémon trading card game has printed billions of cards. Billions. The secondary market for rare cards has turned into a speculative investment vehicle, with individual cards selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. We've seen the same financialization that plagued the housing market and the cryptocurrency space now infecting what was originally a children's game. And when speculative bubbles involve products marketed to children, the ethical implications are staggering.
The grading companies, the sealed product speculation, the warehouse-scale hoarding of children's toys as investment vehicles, this is the logical endpoint of a system that teaches collection as a primary value. And it connects directly to the data economy, because what are these speculators doing? They're using sophisticated data analytics, tracking market trends, monitoring social media sentiment, employing algorithmic pricing models. The surveillance tools of the financial world have been deployed against a children's card game, and somehow we treat this as normal.
Let's bring this home to the science angle one more time, because the Nature article raises a question that I think is the most important one of all. When a generation of scientists has been cognitively shaped by a corporate product, when their brains have literally been restructured by that product, when their research interests and even their species naming conventions reflect that product's influence, can we trust that the science itself is truly independent?
That's not an accusation. It's a genuine epistemological question. And it applies far beyond Pokémon. We live in an era where corporate media has an unprecedented ability to shape cognition at scale, from the algorithms that determine what information we see to the games that restructure our neural pathways. The Pokémon case is just the most visible and well-documented example of a much broader phenomenon, the corporate colonization of human cognition.
And the surveillance infrastructure that enables all of this, the data collection, the behavioral tracking, the algorithmic manipulation, it all operates under the guise of entertainment, convenience, and connection. That's what makes it so effective. You don't resist surveillance that feels like fun. You don't question data collection that comes with a Jigglypuff.
The Nature article, to its credit, does address the concept of research integrity in relation to Pokémon's influence. But it frames it largely in terms of whether Pokémon-inspired research is rigorous, not whether the deeper pattern of corporate influence on science is problematic. And that framing choice itself is telling. When a prestigious journal treats corporate influence on science as an inspiring human interest story rather than a structural concern, we should pay attention to what's being normalized.
So let's connect the dots for our viewers tonight. Here's what we're looking at as we approach this 30-year anniversary. A corporate franchise that has generated over $100 billion in revenue. A franchise that has physically altered the brains of an entire generation. A franchise that deployed one of the largest location surveillance operations in history through a mobile game. A franchise that has embedded its intellectual property into the permanent taxonomic record of life on Earth. And a franchise that has shaped the research interests and methodologies of working scientists worldwide.
And all of this is discussed in polite, admiring terms by the scientific establishment. That's the pattern, Alex. That's what we should be paying attention to. Not whether Pokémon is good or bad, that's a children's question. The adult question is, what does it mean when a single corporate entity has this kind of deep structural influence over how we understand the natural world, how we move through physical space, and how our brains are wired?
And this is where the synthesis really matters, because this story isn't just about Pokémon. It's about the template that Pokémon perfected and that every major tech and media company is now following. Create an engaging, addictive experience. Deploy it at the youngest possible age. Collect behavioral data at every interaction point. Shape cognitive development in ways that serve your business model. And wrap it all in enough charm and nostalgia that anyone who raises concerns is dismissed as a killjoy.
The next frontier of this is already here. Augmented reality, virtual reality, AI companions, all designed to be even more immersive, even more data-hungry, and even more deeply integrated into how we perceive reality. If Pokémon Go could map the movement patterns of 500 million people through a simple mobile game, imagine what the next generation of immersive platforms will be able to extract. The wearable devices, the spatial computing headsets, the AI systems that learn from every interaction.
And the scientific community, which should be our first line of defense in understanding these dynamics, is itself compromised by the very influence we're describing. Not through corruption or conspiracy, but through the more subtle mechanism of cognitive capture. When your brain was literally shaped by a corporate product, when your research career was inspired by that product, your capacity for critical distance is inherently limited. This is not a personal failing. It is a structural condition.
So what do we do with this information? Because Truth Report isn't just about identifying problems. It's about empowering our viewers to think critically and act accordingly. First, be aware. Understand that the entertainment products your children consume are not neutral. They shape cognition, they collect data, and they serve commercial interests. That doesn't mean they're evil. It means they deserve the same scrutiny we apply to any powerful institution.
Second, demand transparency. When a company collects location data from a game primarily played by young people, that data collection should be subject to the highest possible standards of transparency and consent. Not buried in a terms of service agreement that nobody reads. Real, meaningful, informed consent. And regulators need to step up and enforce existing protections like COPPA with the same vigor they bring to other consumer protection domains.
Third, support independent science. When we see that corporate products are shaping research agendas, the answer isn't to ban that influence, which would be impractical and counterproductive. The answer is to fund independent research programs that can provide critical counterweights. We need scientists who study the influence of corporate media on cognition with the same rigor that Pokémon-inspired scientists bring to studying biodiversity.
And finally, question the narrative. When Nature publishes a celebration of Pokémon's influence on science, ask what's not being discussed. When a tech company launches a charming new game that requires location access, ask what the data is being used for. When a media franchise tells you to catch them all, ask who's really catching whom. These questions aren't cynical. They're the foundation of a healthy, informed society.
Because the truth is, Alex, the Pokémon story is ultimately a hopeful one if we're honest about it. Yes, it raised real concerns about data collection and corporate influence. But it also demonstrates the extraordinary power of creative media to inspire genuine scientific curiosity. The challenge for the next 30 years is to preserve that inspiration while building the safeguards that the first 30 years lacked.
Well said, Maya. And that's the Truth Report promise to our viewers. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to make sure you have the information you need to think for yourselves. The Pokémon franchise turns 30 this year. Nature magazine calls it an inspiration to science. We call it all of that, plus the most successful case study in corporate cognitive capture the world has ever seen. And we think you deserve to know both sides.
The facts are verified. The pattern is clear. The questions are on the table. Now it's up to you, our viewers, to decide what to do with them. Because in a world where surveillance comes disguised as entertainment, the most radical act is simply paying attention.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity.
Stay informed. Stay skeptical. And whatever you do, read the terms of service before you catch that next Pokémon. Good night.
Good night, everyone. And remember, the truth doesn't need augmented reality. It just needs people willing to look. See you next time.